Hey everyone, this is chapter 2 of book 1 of Voline's The Unknown Revolution, 1917 to 1921. Book 1 is titled Birth, Growth, and Triumph of the Revolution, 1825 to 1917, and part 1 is titled The First Fruits, 1825 to 1905. The title of Chapter 2 is Repression, Violence, and Failure, Development Continues, 1825 to 1855. And again, I'm reading this from a paperback book, so I'm not looking anything up. All right, so here we go. Repression, Violence, and Failure, Development Continues, 1825 to 1855. The reign of Nicholas I lasted from 1825 to 1855. From a revolutionary point of view, nothing striking characterizes these years. This 30-year period is nevertheless notable in several important respects. Having ascended to the throne in the shadow of the Decembrist revolt, Nicholas I undertook to hold the country in an iron vice, so as to squelch in the bud any expression of liberalism. Nicholas I strengthened absolute rule to the limit and succeeded in transforming Russia into a bureaucratic and repressive state. The French Revolution and the revolutionary movements which subsequently shook Europe were nightmares for Nicholas I. Nicholas I undertook extraordinary precautionary measures. The entire population was closely watched. The arbitrariness of the bureaucracy, the police and the courts no longer had any limits. Any expression of independence, any attempt to elude the iron fist of the police was ruthlessly repressed. Naturally, there was not even a shadow of freedom of speech, assembly, or association. Censorship thrived as never before. All infractions of the, quote, laws, end quote, were punished with utmost severity. The Polish uprising of 1831, drowned in blood with a rare ferocity, as well as the international situation, led the emperor to further accentuate the militarization of the country. People's lives were regulated as in barracks, and severe punishment fell on anyone who tried to avoid the imposed discipline. This sovereign well deserved the name Nicholas the Fierce. In spite of all the measures, or rather because of all the measures, and the measures' nefarious effects, which the Tsar in his blindness did not take into account, the country, namely certain sections of the population, expressed its discontent at every opportunity. The landed nobles, pampered by the emperor who considered them his main support, exploited the serfs with impunity and treated them abominably. The peasants became perceptibly irritated. Acts of rebellion against the, quote, pomeshchiks, lords, and against the local authorities reached alarming proportions. Repressive measures began to lose their effectiveness. The corruption, incompetence, and caprice of the functionaries grew increasingly unbearable. Since the Tsar needed the support and the violence of the functionaries to, quote, keep the people in line, end quote, he would hear nothing and see nothing. The anger of those who suffered from this state of affairs only grew more intense. The vital forces of the society did not stir. Only the official routine, absurd and impotent, was allowed. The situation was unavoidably leading toward the future decomposition of the entire system. Powerful only in appearance, the, quote, regime of the knout, end quote, which I think is like a lashing device, something. I think the knout is something comparable to like the cat of nine tails, but I'm not sure. Some kind of whip. Maybe you know better than me. Was rotting inside. The immense empire was already becoming a, quote, giant with clay feet. Growing sections of the population were becoming aware of this state of affairs. The spirit of opposition against this impossible system was infecting the entire society. It was in these circumstances that the magnificent evolution, both rapid and important, of the young intellectual stratum began. In a country as large and prolific as Russia, youth were numerous among all classes of the population. What was their general outlook? Leaving aside the peasant youth, we can observe that the more or less educated younger generations professed advanced ideas. Mid-19th century youth did not readily accept the slavery of the peasants. Tsarist absolutism shocked them. The study of the Western world, which no amount of censorship could prevent, on the contrary, the censorship gave rise to a taste for forbidden fruit, stimulated their imaginations. The rise of the natural sciences and of materialism made a strong impression on them. It was during the same period that Russian literature, taking its inspiration from humanist principles, flowered and exerted a powerful influence on youth, in spite of the censorship, which it successfully circumvented. At the same time, economically, the labor of the serfs and the absence of all freedoms no longer responded to the pressing needs of the time. For all these reasons, intellectuals, particularly the youth, were theoretically emancipated toward the end of the reign of Nicholas I. The intellectuals were resolutely opposed to serfdom and absolutism. It was during this period that the well-known nihilist current was born, as well as a sharp conflict between conservative, quote, fathers and fiercely progressive, quote, sons, a conflict superbly depicted by Turgenev in Turgenev's novel Fathers and Sons. Out of Russia, a widespread and deeply rooted misunderstanding accompanies the word, quote, nihilism, which originated some 75 years ago in Russian literature and which, due to nihilism's Latin origin, passed into other languages without being translated. In France and elsewhere, quote, nihilism is generally understood as a revolutionary political and social doctrine invented in Russia where it has or had numerous organized adherents. People still speak of a, quote, nihilist party and of the nihilist party's members, the, quote, nihilists. None of this is exact. The term, quote, nihilism was introduced into literature and subsequently into the Russian language by the celebrated novelist Ivan Turgenev, who lived from 1818 to 1883. I think those are the same years that Marx lived. Unless Marx died in 1819, or was born in 1819. Wait, now I'm thinking he was born in 1842. But basically, the same age as Marx. Died the same time, lived the same time. In the middle of the 19th century, in one of his novels, Turgenev used this word to describe a current of ideas and not a doctrine, which appeared among young Russian intellectuals at the end of 1850. The term caught on and quickly became part of the language. This current of ideas had an essentially philosophic and largely moral character. Its field of influence was always limited, since it never went beyond the intellectual stratum. Its standpoint was always personal and pacifist, which did not keep it from being animated by a generous spirit of revolt and guided by the dream of happiness for all humanity. The movement which was set off by this current, if one can speak of a movement, did not go beyond the domains of literature and customs, moeurs, M-O-E-U-R-S, in parentheses. Any other type of movement would have been impossible under the regime of the time. However, in these two domains, it did not hesitate to draw the logical conclusions, which it not only formulated, but also sought to apply individually as rules of conduct. Within these limits, the movement paved the way for an intellectual and moral development which led Russian youth toward some very broad and progressive conceptions. One result was the emancipation of educated women, an achievement of which late 19th century Russia could justly be proud. In spite of its strictly philosophical and individualistic character, this intellectual current, due to its humanistic and liberating spirit, carried the germ of later social conceptions which gave rise to a real revolutionary movement that was both political as well as social. Quote, nihilism prepared the ground for this movement. Quote, nihilism prepared the ground for this movement, which appeared later under the stimulus of European ideas as well as internal and external events. Outside of Russia, the, quote, nihilist, end quote, current is generally confused with the later movement, which was led by parties or organized groups with a program of action and concrete goals. But it is only to the current of ideas, which was a precursor of this movement, that the term nihilist should be applied. As a philosophical conception, nihilism was based on materialism and individualism, understood in their broadest and even exaggerated sense. Force and Matter, the famous book of Buchner, German materialist philosopher who lived from 1824 to 1899, was translated into Russian, clandestinely lithographed, and thousands of copies were distributed despite the risks. The book became the Bible of Russian intellectual youth of the time. The works of Moleschott, Charles Darwin, and several materialist and naturalist authors also exerted a great influence. Materialism was accepted as an unquestionable absolute truth. As materialist, the nihilist engaged in an unrelenting war against religion and against everything which escapes pure reason or positive proof, against everything which is beyond material reality or beyond values with no practical use. In short, against everything which is spiritual, sentimental, or idealistic. The nihilist scorned aesthetics, beauty, comfort, spiritual enjoyment, sentimental love, fashion, the desire to please. The nihilist went so far as to completely reject art as a manifestation of idealism. The nihilist great ideologist, the brilliant publicist Pisarev, who died in an accident when he was young, formulated in one of his articles his famous parallel between a worker and an artist. Pisarev held that any cobbler was infinitely more admirable than Raphael, since the first produces useful material objects while the paintings of the second serve no purpose. In his writings, Pisarev fervently applied materialistic and utilitarian principles to dethrone the great poet Pushkin. The nihilist Bazarov, in Turgenev's novel, says, quote, "Nature is not a temple but a laboratory, and man is there to work," end quote. When speaking of the, quote, "unrelenting war," end quote, waged by the nihilist, one must understand a literary and verbal war, and no more. Nihilism's activity was limited to a veiled propaganda of nihilism's ideas in journals and among intellectuals. It was not easy to spread this propaganda since it was necessary to take into account the censorship as well as the Tsarist police, which suppressed, quote, "foreign heresies," end quote, and all independent thought. The, quote, "external," end quote, manifestations of nihilism consisted mainly of dressing very plainly and behaving uninhibitedly. For example, nihilist women generally had short hair, often wore glasses to make themselves ugly and emphasize their contempt for beauty and stylishness, dressed in coarse clothing to defy fashion, walked like men and smoked in order to proclaim the equality of the sexes and demonstrate their contempt for the rules of convention. These extravagances did not in any way diminish the seriousness of the movement. The impossibility of any other type of, quote, "exteriorization," end quote, explained and, in large measure, justified them. In the realm of personal morality, the nihilists practiced an absolute rigorism. But the main principle of nihilism was a form of specific individualism. Only a very natural reaction against everything which the Russia of that period suppressed. This individualism ended up by denouncing, in the name of absolute individual freedom, all constraints, obligations, and obstacles, and all the traditions imposed on man by society, the family, customs, morals, beliefs, established conventions. The complete emancipation of the individual, whether man or woman, from everything which might infringe on his independence or his freedom of thought. This was the basic idea of nihilism. The complete emancipation of the individual, whether man or woman, from everything which might infringe on his independence or his freedom of thought. This is the basic idea of nihilism. It defended the sacred right of the individual to total liberty and to the inviolability of his life. The reader can understand why this current of ideas is called nihilism. This term was used to describe the partisans of an ideology which accepted nothing of that which was natural and sacred for others, family, society, religion, traditions. When one asks such a person, quote, "What do you admit? What do you approve in the environment which surrounds you, and which claims to have the right and even the duty to control you?" end quote, he answered, quote, "Nothing." Nihil. He was a nihilist. In spite of its essentially individualistic and philosophical character, nihilism defended the freedom of the individual in an abstract manner rather than against the ruling despotism. Nihilism prepared the ground for the concrete struggle against the real and immediate obstacle. The concrete political, economic, for concrete, political, economic, and social liberation. But it did not itself undertake this struggle. It did not even ask the question, what can be done to actually liberate the individual? To the very end, It stayed in the realm of purely ideological discussions and purely moral achievements. The other question, the question of direct action for liberation, was posed by the next generation during the period between 1870 and 1880. It was then the first revolutionary and socialist groups were formed in Russia. Action began, but it no longer had anything in common with the nihilism of former days. Where am I? Even the word was discarded. It remained in the Russian language as a purely historical term, a relic and souvenir of the intellectual movement of 1860 to 1870. The fact that abroad people erroneously used the term, quote, nihilism to refer to the entire Russian revolutionary movement before, quote, Bolshevism, and speak of a, quote, nihilist party, is due to lack of knowledge of the real history of the revolutionary movements in Russia. The outrageously reactionary government of Nicholas I refused to recognize either the real situation of the intellectual ferment. Instead, it defied society by creating a secret political police, the well-known Okhrana, quote, security, and special corps of police to destroy the movement. Political persecutions became a true scourge. We might remember that during this period, the young Dostoevsky was almost executed and was imprisoned for belonging to a completely harmless study group inspired by Petrashevsky. That the first great Russian critic and publicist, Belinsky, barely succeeded in making himself heard. That another great publicist, Herzen, was forced to become an expatriate, not to mention accomplished and active revolutionaries like Bakunin. All of this repression did not succeed in calming the agitation, the causes of which were too deeply rooted. It succeeded even less in improving the situation. The Tsar's remedy was to strengthen the repressive and bureaucratic apparatus still more. Concurrently, Russia was drawn into the Crimean War of 1854 to 1855. This was a catastrophe. The vicissitudes of the war factually demonstrated the bankruptcy of the regime and the real weakness of the empire. The, quote, clay feet, end quote, gave way for the first time. Naturally, the lesson served no important purpose. The state's political and social sores were exposed. Nicholas I, defeated, died in 1855 as soon as the war was lost. Perfectly aware of the bankruptcy but unable to face up to it, he probably died of the moral shock. Some even insisted that Nicholas I committed suicide by poisoning himself. This interpretation is highly plausible, but there is no proof. We must insist on a little-known fact to help the reader understand what follows. In spite of all the weaknesses and obstacles, during this period, the country made considerable cultural and technical progress. In spite of all the weaknesses and obstacles, during this period, the country made considerable cultural and technical progress. Driven by inescapable economic necessities, quote, national industry was born, simultaneously giving birth to a working class, a, quote, proletariat. Large factories were established in several cities. Harbors were opened. Coal, iron, and gold mines began to operate. Transportation networks were enlarged and improved. The first express railway was constructed, connecting St. Petersburg, Leningrad, and Moscow, the two capitals of this immense country. This railway is an engineering marvel, since the region between these two cities is unsuited for this type of construction. The land is not firm and frequently consists of swamps and marshes. The distance between St. Petersburg and Moscow is about 600 versts, 400 miles. From the standpoint of an economically rational construction, there could be no question of a straight route. It is said that Nicholas I, who took a personal interest in the project, the state was doing the construction, ordered various engineers to draw up and present blueprints with estimates. These engineers, taking advantage of the situation, presented the emperor with projected routes which were extremely complicated, entailing numerous switchbacks, etc. Nicholas understood. Glancing briefly at the blueprints, Nicholas pushed them aside, took a pencil and piece of paper, drew 2 points connected them with a straight line, and said, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, end quote. It was a formal order, without appeal. The engineers only had to carry it out, which the engineers did, thus accomplishing a genuine feat. It was a gargantuan task, accomplished at an unbelievable cost, causing devastating hardship for thousands of workers. From its completion, The Nicholas's Railway has been one of the world's most remarkable railways, where there are exactly 609 versts, 405 miles of track, in an almost perfectly straight line. We should note that the emergent working class continued to retain close ties with the countryside from which it came and to which it returned as soon as the quote outside end quote work was finished. Furthermore, as we have seen, the peasants attached to the land of their lords could not leave it permanently. Before they could be employed in industrial projects, special arrangements had to be made with their landowners. The real workers of the cities, at this time an itinerant craftsmen, were a very small contingent. Thus we are not yet dealing with a quote proletariat in the proper sense of the term, but the impetus for the creation of such a proletariat was already there. The need for reliable and regular laborers was one of the pressing economic reasons which demanded the abolition of serfdom. 2 or 3 generations hence, the class of wage laborers, the real industrial proletariat, no longer tied to the land, was going to appear in Russia as it had elsewhere. There were also great advances in the cultural realm. Well-to-do parents wanted their children to be educated and cultured. The rapidly growing number of high school and college students forced the government to continually increase the number of secondary schools and institutions of higher education. Economic and technical needs, as well as the general development of the country, also demanded educational establishments. At the end of Nicholas's reign, Russia had 6 universities in Moscow, Dorpat, Kharkov, Kazan, St. Petersburg, and Kiev, listed in the order of the dates of their founding, as well as several schools for advanced technical or special studies. Thus the widespread legend that all of Russia at this time was uneducated, barbarian, almost, quote, savage, end quote, is false. The peasant population under serfdom was indeed uneducated and, quote, savage, but the inhabitants of the cities had no reason to envy the cultural achievements of their Western counterparts, except in some purely technical realms. As for the intellectual youth, they were, in some respects, even more advanced than the youth of other European countries. This enormous paradoxical gap between the mentality of the enslaved population and the cultural level of the privileged strata has already been mentioned earlier. That's the end of Chapter 2 of Book 1, Part 1 of Voline's The Unknown Revolution. Thanks for listening.